and I'm privileged to be in Taiwan first and foremost. So my first experience of Asian culture here. I've really enjoyed today talking to Dr. Zhao and getting to know about his interests in Chinese culture, and I'm really looking forward to working in the future, and perhaps we can develop some kind of some cooperation there. So I'm particularly interested in different cultures, but the culture that I come from is a mixture of an American culture and English culture. So I was born in England, but when I was 10 years old, my family moved to California in the United States. So I've grown up with a mixture of American and English culture, and I do feel more English than American, but nonetheless, America's culture continues to fascinate me. And what I'll be talking about today is mainly about my interest in American cinema, because this is what I studied at university, and it was also the focus of my master's research. So I studied a lot of film for my master's in the UK at UCL. But I shouldn't have said the word UCL. UCL and King's they have a bit of a rivalry together. So my roots are in King's, not UCL. So let's start with the first slide here. So, as I said, my interests are in film studies, and that's what I teach at King's, basically. I teach two things. I teach English language, so preparing students for undergraduate or postgraduate study at King's, but I also teach film studies, and I teach it at a pre-undergraduate level. So I'm training students how to write essays so that they can continue their first year at King's doing film studies. The first thing that when students see film studies is they think, film studies is the degree that I need to do to become a director. But it's not the same thing. Film studies is different to filmmaking. If you think of film studies, the subject that I teach, think of film studies as more similar to literature. So the purpose, the job of a film studies student is to watch a film and then to kind of interpret it for meaning according to its form. This is like the technical way in which it's made. That could be anything from the way the camera is used to the way sound is used, but also thinking about the context. So when I say context, you're interpreting the film according to the society that produced that film. So what was happening in, for example, American society at the time that the film was being made. So what was influencing the film? What kind of cultural issues were influencing the film? I'm not sure how popular film studies is in Asia, but in the UK it continues to be a kind of a respected degree. It's not like a kind of a joke degree that, my child's going to go to university and watch films for 3 years, but it's a serious degree, and it's well respected. Employers in London, for example, they hire a number of film studies undergraduates, and they see the skills that those undergraduates have developed as being very useful for whatever industry they want to work in. It could be something like journalism, or it could be working like me as a lecturer in a university. One good thing about King's is that it's the #1 for film studies in the UK, according to the domestic league tables. So that was kind of a surprise, but King's has developed a really good reputation for film studies, and according to The Guardian, it's the best at the moment. So I don't work for the film studies department, but I work with the film studies department. As I said, I'm training the students to be able to survive on an undergraduate course. So the main genre that I'm talking about today is the Western. So I studied the Western at university, and you can see here on the screen behind me, there's a variety of different Westerns made, starting from one of the earliest ones in the 1920s called My Darling Clementine, and then continuing up to 2003 with the film Brokeback Mountain. Do you know who the director of Brokeback Mountain was? Ang Lee, right. So he's like a huge hero. not only for American audiences, but obviously here in Taiwan. Yeah, he's a really, really important director in the United States. And when I was living there, I grew up watching a lot of his kind of early films. One of the ones that you may not have seen, The Ice Storm, was one of my favorite films that came out in 1997, the year that I moved back to London to start my life again in England. So, oops, sorry. So this is a quote from Ang Lee talking in 2005. And he says, "I think the American West really attracts me because it's romantic. The desert, the empty space, it's a great stage for drama. Also, it attracted me because of the unfamiliarity. There's something very romantic about the West." And that's the same thing with China. Something romantic is always set in the West. So the Gobi Desert. I've never visited the Gobi Desert yet, but in my mind, I imagine it to be similar to the same setting that we see in the main film, which I will talk about later, called The Searchers. So often the Westerns are set in these kind of expansive desert landscapes. And there is a romance, I agree with Ang Lee about this, there is a romance there because it's kind of an area of self-discovery. So where you can lose yourself, you leave civilization and you start to connect with nature. So I think that's what Ang Lee's getting at here. And that's what was probably behind his reason to make two westerns. So he made not only Brokeback Mountain, but he also made another western called Ride with the Devil, which was set during the American Civil War. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. So Robert Bergogne is a famous academic in the UK, and he works for St Andrews University. St Andrews is the University of Prince William, if you didn't know that. But he's the professor of film studies there, and he said, in his opinion, in the 20th century United States, the narrative forms that have most molded, this means shaped, national identity most profoundly are arguably the Western and the war film. And you can see below here, this is the film I'll be talking about later, called The Searchers. And it stars, do you know who this actor is here? Have you seen this actor before? A very famous American actor. Do you recognize him? His name's John Wayne. John Wayne, I'll be talking, yeah, John Wayne. And you can see this is John Wayne in The Searchers. This is a very, very famous image in Hollywood cinema of John Wayne as a cowboy. It's a very beautiful image. He's standing in between the doorway there. So there's this kind of this message immediately coming through to you that he's a man trapped in between civilization and that desert landscape that I was talking about before. And this is John Wayne also, and he's starring in a war film there. This was The Green Berets, and it's actually the only American war film which supported America's effort in the Vietnam War. So what we can see from that is that John Wayne he's a very political figure. He was kind of a very nationalistic character. He supported the Vietnam War when most of America was against the Vietnam War. And here's a picture of him blown up. As you can see, he's a very strong, kind of macho type character, and that made him perfect to play the cowboy in many of his films. Where I grew up in California, the main airport well, not the main airport, the second biggest airport in California, well, Southern California, is called John Wayne Airport. So it's named after him. You can see the kind of legacy that he's left behind. So one of the things I want to talk about now is like the myth. Do you know what I mean when I say like the myth of the cowboy? Have you heard of this word before? Myth? What is a myth?
Like a mystery?
A little bit, kind of like a mystery, yeah. It's something that's not quite similar. The truth isn't necessarily the same as the myth. So I can see the connection with the mystery. Yeah, it's kind of like a story though. Myth is like a story that we tell each other over and over again. And it has something to do with imagination as well. It's not necessarily connected to reality. And that's significant because the cowboy, as you can see there's a cowboy here on the left, he has been He's very popular in American imaginations. He's a very powerful symbol of America. You can see this is a cowboy down here, and he's advertising Marlboro cigarettes. So that was very popular, very effective advertising technique in America. To sell cigarettes, it was good to show a cowboy in the advertising, because it made people think, oh, if I smoke, I will be like this kind of like strong, macho, sexy, cool type of person. So that, and the same thing we've seen, a similar thing we've seen with Levi's jeans. So if you're a fan of Levi's jeans, the cowboy was often used as a kind of a symbol that. So all of that is a kind of myth making. It's kind of building the mythology of the cowboy. So this is a famous painting called American Progress, and as you can see in the picture, the painting by John Gass, that there's an angel here, and she is carrying telephone wire, and effectively she's spreading civilization from the east coast of America to the west, and you can see that the settlers are following underneath her there. So that's a visual representation of this kind of this manifest destiny, trying the idea that America was promised to stretch from the east coast to the west coast of America. Now, the Western obviously has a historical basis, and it was set approximately during 1860 to 1910. So most Westerns, when you watch a Western like The Searchers, the time scale for it will be in these 50 years here. So what's happening in America in 1860 to 1910? Well, it was a period of westward expansion. So like the manifest destiny was moving faster. It was also the time of the Civil War. So the American Civil War is one of the most interesting periods of US history, but it's also one of the most painful parts of American history. It was effectively a war between the North states in America and the Southern states, and it was over the right to have slaves. So this is the kind of the political context which is happening in the lead up to many of the Western stories that we see in Western films. But equally at that time, we have these popular characters emerging that were based on real individuals. So on the left here, if you've ever watched a Western, or you may be familiar with some of these famous characters which we see in Westerns. Then we have Wyatt Earp on the left, who was a lawman, kind of often portrayed as the good guy, as a kind of a hero in Westerns. Whereas Jesse James in the middle there, he was a famous outlaw, so a famous criminal who could shoot guns very well, as could Wild Bill Hickok, who was again another famous gunslinger, so was able to shoot his target very effectively with his guns. But going back to Eric Hobsbawm, we're talking about the myth versus reality, and often those stories that we see in Westerns, they're not quite the same as what was actually happening in reality at that time. So on the right here, we can see what Eric Hobsbawm makes the point that when you opened a newspaper in the early 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, you were more likely to see a newspaper filled with real estate, so advertisements selling houses, selling property at that time. Whereas when we watch a Western film, what we're more likely to imagine in our heads is there would always be gunfights. So there would probably be some fights in bars and saloons, and it would be a very violent kind of a place for heroes to battle villains, but that wasn't really the truth. The reality was slightly more ordinary than that. And I'll talk in a minute about the buffalo as well, because this was also a key period. This animal was being killed near to extinction during the same time. So, as I've said here, it wasn't really the Wild West. It wasn't really like a kind of a violent, exciting time to live in necessarily. One of the main themes that we see in the Western is the spread of civilization. So similar to the Manifest Destiny, we saw the civilization spreading from the east to the west. But the picture down here shows a picture of a dead buffalo. This animal here at the bottom was actually being hunted by white settlers close to extinction. And there did come a point when the buffalo here was only 300 remaining in the United States. And the reason why these buffalo were being killed extensively at the time of the Civil War and beyond was because white settlers were trying to push the Indians, the Native American Indians, off their land. And that's a kind of a story that doesn't appear in Westerns until the 1960s. It's a period of American history that wasn't really acknowledged until later in the Western genre. So in effect, as Hobsbawm argues, the reality is much more mundane and uglier than the myths that Americans grew up with. So when I say the reality is much more mundane, I mean it's much more ordinary. And here's a picture of that very beautiful creature called the buffalo. Now the numbers are much healthier, and that they actually managed to bring more buffalo back into the wild, so it has survived, but as I said, it was down to 300 at one point, so very near to extinction. And as I said, it was being hunted so that the Native Americans could not use this very precious animal for food and for clothes, which they were dependent on. Here's another famous painting called The Trail of Tears, which shows the removal of the Native American people from their land. President Andrew Jackson at that time had signed the Indian Removal Act, and this was to facilitate the American concept that I told you about called Manifest Destiny. The idea was to spread civilization to the territories where the Native Americans were living. And this is a very sad period of American history because, as with the buffalo, the Cherokee people they died in their thousands because of starvation, because of the conditions were very brutal, the weather was awful, so many Native Americans died in this kind of bad deal they got with the US government at that time. And Jackson says in that essay, the American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried out in the Susan Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. These were the two boats which traveled, as I told you, with John Winthrop in discovery of the New World. Rather, the American dream came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. So the point there is that each time that the frontier was pushed back, that was creating excitement for Americans. It was because it was feeling like this is the American dream. This is like where the birth of America was coming from. These two films came out last year, and the one on the left won the best film at the Oscars. So this is a film called The Revenant, and it's a story directed by Alejandro Inarritu, who's an Argentinian director, and his film is about living on the frontier. I think when you look at which films often win Oscars in America, it's the ones that have to do with the birth of American identity. They're often very, very successful. These kind of stories about living on the frontier, living in wilderness, living in brutal, harsh conditions. Those are the kinds of stories that continue to win Oscars. Similarly, you have a film by Quentin Tarantino called The Hateful Eight. This is set, again, it's another Western. We could call both of them Westerns, but it's set during that, and the story revolves around terrible weather conditions which drive the main characters into a hotel. Interestingly, both films are about racism as well, which is racism being the feeling that one race is better than the other, and that's a problem which stems from the Civil War, and it's also at the heart of The Searchers, which I'll show you some clips of in a minute. I'm not going to speak too long about this, but what you need to know about the history is that it's as old as 1903, so some of the first technically important films were Westerns. They were all set in Hollywood. Hollywood was the perfect location for Westerns because it's a desert landscape. Hollywood is built on a desert in California, so it was the perfect place to film these outdoor movies. The classical phase starts with Stagecoach, which was directed by John Ford in 1939. One thing to note about the way that the Western themes change is that in 1930s you have the Great Depression, which is the kind of the worst economic period that America had ever experienced. And therefore Americans were very disillusioned. But as you move into 1940s, America enters World War II, and the films start to become very optimistic as a result. This is where we start to see the kind of the hero emerge in American cinema. So it was that kind of period, from that transition from the Great Depression to World War II, where this idea of the hero and the cowboy hero emerges from. You get this kind of big surge of optimism in American cinema. So with the war, Americans became much more nationalistic, and that was having an effect on the film. And you can hear that the character at the end, the actor saying, Shakespeare was not made for taverns, nor was it made for tavern louts. So he's saying that, you know, you're not ready for this culture, you're not ready for this kind of like intellectualism that he was bringing. But two of the characters were. You can see two of them are interested. And that's an important theme in the Western, because it's like the good, in a sense, the good characters are trying to bring civilization to this kind of like lawless town where there's often murders and there's drinking and smoking and prostitutes and so on. So that's one of the key things that you'll see in any Western that you watch. It's kind of this conflict between civilization and lawlessness. And it's a great film. That really was my favorite film that I watched when I was on an American cinema course. I really, if you want to watch a Western, watch this one. It's a lovely story. And unlike many of the newer Westerns, it has a happy ending. So that's a good thing. It's very easy to distinguish the heroes from the villains as well, I felt, in that scene. One of the things in terms of film language was, notice how the camera points upwards at the Shakespeare actor, and that creates a feeling of importance, like the actor is someone who deserves respect. That's just a kind of a simple film studies technique that a student would pick up on in an essay. If they were writing an essay, they would describe that shot to show the kind of the power relation between the characters that are listening and the character that is speaking. And I'm going to get you to do that as well in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about what a film studies student has to do on a course. So as I said at the beginning, film studies students in the UK, they need to write essays, but they're not making films, they're interpreting essays. And how do you interpret essays? Well, you need to be able to use the 4 cinematic elements. By using the 4 cinematic elements, what you're doing is you're performing textual analysis. So the text is the film, and the analysis is what you're doing as a student. You're saying, okay, this is what's happening in the scene, the camera is doing this, the person is saying that, the lighting is creating this effect, the music is doing this, and all of that is combining together to create some kind of meaning. So let's break down the 4 cinematic elements. The first one is from a French word called mise en scène, which literally means placing on stage, or what's in the shot. The easiest way I like to think of mise en scène is like, if you like painting, and you like, for example, looking at a painting like Sunflowers by Vincent van Gogh, in order to think about the painting, you'll look at everything that is inside the frame, everything that is carefully arranged inside the picture frame. That's what mise en scène is. It's what is being placed on the stage or in front of the camera. You can break down mise en scène into these different components. So the costume, what the person is wearing, the lighting, so this lighting here, for example, the action or the actors, so what the characters are doing, you know, like are they, like for example, one of the actors in the Shakespeare scene was performing. He was performing a piece from Shakespeare's Hamlet. And then there's the makeup, so like, you know, what is on the face. Usually, if you want to identify a villain, the villain will have like kind of black kind of smudges on his face, yeah, so, or he'll wear a black hat. Yeah, that's a good way of kind of showing to the audience that this is a bad person, it's a villain. Then there'll be props, so the props are things like the gun or the glass of beer. And then finally you have the setting. The setting is crucial in the Western. So every time earlier I was talking about like that landscape, and I was talking about the desert, like for example the Gobi Desert in China, yeah, that is also part of the mise en scène, because it's what you see in the shot, it's the location. The second element is cinematography, and this has to do with camera angles and camera moves. So when we had the shot of the Shakespeare actor on the stage, we call that a low angle shot, because the camera is low down and it's pointing upwards. So when the camera moves, that's an aspect of cinematography. We then have editing. So editing is how you arrange the film. If you've got Mac computers, you've probably edited a film that you've made yourself using the iMovie software. So that's what editing is. It's cuts, it's dissolves. And then finally we have sound. Sound is broken down into two different types of sound, diegetic and non-diegetic. It looks complicated, but it's not. Diegetic means sound from the real world. So right now, this is diegetic sound. I am talking to you from the real world. Non-diegetic sound comes from the artificial world. So if we listen to a soundtrack, so for example, music being played on a violin, then that would be non-diegetic sound, because it's not from the real world, it's from the fake world. So that's how we break down sound into two different forms.
Great. So what did you notice? Did you notice, did any of the elements kind of, did they stick out in your mind at all? Did anything make an impression on you at all? For me, the two interesting things are the setting, so part of mise en scène. They stand on either side of the train tracks there. So the train track is kind of like, it's symbolically dividing the good guys from the bad guys. And that's the main point of the film, right? They're fighting for the control of this railroad. Yeah, who can control the train via the water supply. So I really like the way that the film is shot in that sense, the kind of the mise en scène, what is placed in the shot. The second thing is that you see these kind of, I like the difference that's used with the sound. You see when he's playing the harmonica there? What is that for you? Is that, what do you notice about that? Is it diegetic or is it non-diegetic sound there? I don't know if you remember the difference there. Non-diegetic, isn't it? Yeah, because the sound would not be that loud, would it? The harmonica noise would not be that loud. So it's kind of an artificial. Morricone is using the kind of amplifying the sounds there. He's playing with them, perhaps to try and get you to think, to pay more attention to the character. You know, to think about like who is this mysterious character, and with this harmonica, it draws you in and it makes you focus more on like what's he going to do? Who is that person?